Hello, I'm Nicole Presley. I am the Director of Organizing Strategy on the Side with Love team at the Unitarian Universalist Association. I am a brown-skinned Black woman with natural hair, with a deep purple uh, lipstick on and a sage sweater. I am here today with Pablo de Jesus, who is the executive director of the Unitarian Universalist for Social Justice. And we're going to be talking a little bit about today the climate justice and how it is connected to immigration justice. Um, so, Pablo, if you wanted to give us a quick introduction of yourself.
Sure. My name is Pablo de Jesus. I am the executive director of the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice, as Nicole mentioned. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., and our self-constructed identity is as your Unitarian Universalist ministry for federal engagement. So we take pride and joy in trying to build a UU movement to engage your federal legislators, whether that's with advocacy or agitation. Certainly the street work nowadays feels omnipresent and super important. So I'm happy to be here with you, Nicole.
I'm happy to be here with you. I remember as a new Unitarian Universalist and working in a UU congregation and being a person that cared and was concerned about social justice. UUSJ, Unitarian Universalist for Social Justice, was one of the first organizations I was introduced to related to UU showing up in their values. And now we get to work together, which is very exciting. So I'm just very excited to lead a program at the Unitarian Universalist Association called Side with Love. Side with Love brings our values, our Unitarian Universalist values, to life through mobilizing leaders with congregations and beyond. We work on four key issues: democracy, climate justice, bodily autonomy, and decriminalization, and all of the intersections that exist in and among those issues. With these initiatives, we build power alongside partners and local, state, and national campaigns. But as we know, and as Audre Lorde says, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. So, part of our ongoing commitment is to root our climate actions in climate justice and to understand how climate justice is connected to all of the UUA's justice priorities. And we're doing this video series called Climate at the Intersections to demonstrate that, where we'll explore climate justice as a racial justice issue, as a gender justice issue, and as a disability justice issue, and more. And that is why we are here today with our friend Pablo um, to root our climate actions in climate justice and learn a little bit how Pablo and his leadership understands climate justice as well as an intersection in immigration justice. So with that, Pablo, how would you describe the connection between climate justice and immigration justice?
Before I get started, let me just say I'm really happy to be doing this interview, this interaction, because when everything is said and done at UUSJ, we also think about our issue portfolios as interconnected and intersectional. So while we'll be discussing climate justice and immigration justice today, we feel profoundly and very deeply that our work in any one of those two areas is connected to our work for a healthy democracy, as well as our work for economic justice. So the things are connected. And in fact, I think in some ways that'll be the the center point of my comments today. So in my view, the connection between climate justice and immigration justice can be best summarized as climate forced displacement and the incessant persistent abuse of others in our economies and societies. That's really where this issue sits. So in the case of, when we're thinking about immigration, the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights offers the following, right? They say climate change, global migration, and human rights are inextricably linked as global warming advances around the world, increasing numbers of people are being displaced from their lands, their livelihoods, and their homes, becoming internally displaced peoples within their own countries or forced to migrate across international borders. And as they are displaced, access to human rights becomes an ever more important challenge in the pursuit of safety, work, and a new home. So that's an explicitly immigration and refugee frame on it. But I also like this way that the Center for Law and Social Policy puts it, which is that leading researchers agree that environmental destabilization caused by the climate crisis is one of the driving factors for people migrating to and seeking asylum in the United States. But pollution and poor environmental practices in this country also harm immigrant families by causing serious long-term health problems. Our nation's exclusionary healthcare policies leave families with little or no way of addressing this harmful exposure. So those are like sort of some high-level statements that I think really showcase what we're talking about. But then there are environmental justice organizations that go a little further, that say it a little more directly. And I think as Unitarian Universalists, we should sit with some of that language as well. So the organization Gaia says that there is no environmental justice without immigration justice. Standing with immigrants, migrants, and refugees in the United States is not only standing in alignment with justice, it is also integral to our work as environmental justice advocates. It has never made sense to separate justice issues as they are caused and impacted by the same systems of oppression. But if that doesn't make it clear enough for you, then there's this wonderful institute called the Othering and Belonging Institute. I like their products. And they say immigration justice is climate justice. The struggles for immigration justice and climate justice are inextricably linked. Their victories exist in a positive feedback loop, each imperative to the other's success. As trials of climate change, displacement, and anti-immigration efforts and violence ensue internationally, policies that acknowledge the U.S. contribution to climate change and serve those displaced by extreme climatic events must be put forward to ensure that those most impacted by climate-induced displacement are protected and safeguarded. So again, that's putting a much finer point on this conversation and this issue. But if that wasn't enough, I have one final quote for you, which is from the Climate Justice Coalition. And I really love the way they frame things. They keep it like real homespun, they just keep it real, And so the quote that by them that explains this for me is climate justice means migrant justice. The most marginalized communities on the front line of the climate crisis and often face its worst impacts. Indigenous peoples, small-scale farmers, and communities living in poverty are disproportionately impacted by intersecting multiple global crises. The communities are forcibly displaced and then routinely denied the right to migrate safely. The climate justice movement must center these communities and the foreground of their struggles. Those are others talking about this issue, but to be sure, we use sort of acknowledge and say similar things. Side with Love, create climate justice says similar things. UU Ministry for Earth says similar things. The UU Service Committee has done a lot of work on climate force displacement, and indeed UUSJ, the organization I lead, has a similar worldview, and we ground our work in our Unitarian Universalist values. We all hold sort of simpatico views on these issues, grounded in our theology and work, building in various ways on the legacies of efforts in or to be in right relationship, to widen our circle of concern and often founded in deep discernment around the eighth principle and more. So yes, we all use our own particular organizational voice, our own vibe and tenor, our twang, if you want to use that expression, to sort of do the work and talk about the work. But we are, as a UU community of justice makers, we are in alignment with this basic worldview about how immigration justice and climate justice intersect and are interwoven. So to sort of circle back to what I said at the start, which is, if we open our hearts and minds, I think we see clearly that immigrants and migrants are included in climate justice. The marginalized and the vulnerable people, BIPOC folks especially, are included here as part of environmental racism. And so are women and people with disabilities. And in my view, so are queer folk, because we're all part of that othering that our economy and society engages in sort of rampant and just nonstop ways. And fundamentally, climate and immigration justice are connected as social and economic phenomena within the elements of injustice that they express on the people, right, on the planet. So environmental injustice occurs when marginalized people and groups face those disproportionate environmental impacts that so many of the quotes talked about, and they then face a range of threats and consequences. And in my humble view, most of us UUs accept that basic idea. But we grapple with how to put it into practice day in, day out, or project in, project out, and we don't always remember to center it in every aspect of the work that we do. But if you like to have an academic sort of foundation for this, I like another quote by the Columbia University Climate School, which puts it this way: more or less, climate change is a threat to everyone's physical health, mental health, air, water, food, and shelter. But some groups, socially and economically disadvantaged ones, face the greatest risks. This is because of where they live, their health, their income, their language barriers, and perhaps limited access to resources. In the United States, these more vulnerable communities are largely communities of color, immigrants, low-income communities, and people for whom English is not their native language. As time goes on, they bear the worst impacts of climate change and will do so unless we recognize that fighting climate change and advancing environmental justice are inextricably linked. So to go back to your opening quote, Nicole, you use in general embrace the idea of intersectional work, multi-sectional work, breaking down silos. And when we're talking about environment and climate justice and almost anything else, the challenge we have is to keep a hold of that basic idea that the fictitious and false differences exist, because that is in fact what the oppressive forces in our society want us to engage in. They want us to be reacting to the fictitious and fake siloing of these issues, because if we are thinking about them as a holistic human planetary complex, then we begin to understand that our power is not just the environmental and climate justice activists. It's also the economic justice activists. It's also the immigration activists. It's also the folks who are fighting for trans rights and LGBTQ rights. It's also the folks who deeply care about our republic and whether or not we have a democracy in the foreseeable future. Perhaps I'm being naively optimistic, but for the most part, I think in our core, as human beings, in our spirits, as human beings, we know this. We know that the environment and climate are deeply connected to these other issues. And that's worth remembering. The challenge is to remember it in the work as you're doing it. So that's sort of what I'd want to say on why there is, in fact, a connection between environment and climate justice and immigration justice. I don't think it's really open for debate. What's open is whether or not you agree and whether or not you are willing to live into that reality.
Yes, I think it is. I think when you take it down to similar to the Audre Lorde quote that we opened with, when you take it down to the experiential level, right, it becomes very clear how intersectional the issues are, right? As someone that is from Niagara Falls, right, and so grew up with the in the wake of the Love Canal. Were people sick, right, because of being a part on this poison land, or were they sick because they also did not have um, the financial capacity, right, to continue to seek healthcare and to pay for that, right? When folks are already pushed to sometimes poison land, right? Or places where the water is being poisoned. Is their economic situation after housing prices collapse? Because of course no one else wants to move into this neighborhood. Is that a capitalism issue or is that a climate issue? Um, and even, I remember after Hurricane Katrina, the university I was attending, right, accepting students, right, from Tulane. But they weren't accepting students from other universities, right? You got an automatic acceptance, but only if you were from this school. So these people having easier roads to continue their education than maybe other folks did.
Yeah.
Um, when we take it down to the level of the story of the person being impacted, we somehow find that the impacts that climate have on people, right, are not solely divorced from what's their social condition, where do they live, what is their economic situation, what identity do they have? What else, what other kind of systems are impacting them? And you said that we have to remember, right? One of the last things you said was that you use kind of have to hold uh that in their mind as they're doing justice work because, as the quote goes, right? The arc of the moral universe, if it is bending towards justice, right? That means no matter what issue we're working on, our destination is justice, right? No matter what pathway you're taking, we're trying to get to the same place. So why do you think it's important for Unitarian Universalists, right, to understand these connections? And how do they take action based on that specific understanding?
I'm glad that you reiterated and brought up again our theology as you use, because that's really important in addressing this particular question. Why is it important for you to use to understand this connection? So to expand on that a bit, disclaimer, I'm not a theologian. I'm not a minister, so I didn't study the Bible from the UU perspective. I'm not going to parry with anyone about the quotes and the proper biblical interpretations. But I do act for justice in these spaces with UUs, and I have some pretty strong feelings about how this question connects to our theology. So to expand a bit, um, climate and immigration justice are woven together in our tapestry of justice. That is one of the things that we as UUs hold. It's part of that entire fabric for justice. So you made the reference to the famous quote, "The arc of the moral universe," but embedded in that concept is that things are put together in an alloy for justice, right? Like we're actively shaping that work. Our lives, generation in, generation out, are part and parcel of creating the bend in the arc for justice. Um, and I feel very strongly that our theology calls us to envision who is included in our sacred and secular whole. And and for me, uh, then you get into questions of, well, how do you manage that? So on the one side, you have the theological frame, but on the other hand, on the other side, you need some practical way to frame the work. And for me, that comes down to abolitionist thinking, right? And because abolitionist thinking calls us to, in my understanding, in my sense of the world and the frame, imagine and pursue that positive alternative future, right? And so that's part and parcel of our theology. Like we are trying to get to a better place. We are evolving not only ourselves, but our faith and our communities towards that better place. And we believe deeply and strongly that love is a power that will carry us to that better place if we put our hand to the tiller and our hands to the oars. I feel like in general, UUs are fairly comfortable with that sort of liberatory theology. Not perfectly so, because none of us are perfect. It is a constant journey, but I think we all get the basics. And we have the advantage of our congregations, churches, and fellowships sort of helping us, and our ministers teaching us the ways of thinking and being liberatory in our theology. The abolitionist thread is a little less obvious, at least upon casual consideration. And that's where a lot of UU professional organizers like yourself, Nicole, or me, or others that are on the landscape for justice making, where we sort of play a role, right? To help folks understand that fiber and the weave that we're trying to build and make in our justice making. And so for me, when you draw your circle of us to include everyone, everything, all beings, sentient, animal, mineral, viral, bacterial, you eventually get to a people, right? Or for many of us, that's actually where we start. We start with the people and then we go to the other things. And that is where our Unitarian Universalist commonly held religious values and theology take us to the joyful awe that we hold in sacred love. But what about all the people? That is harder to get a handle on in practice rather than theory. And for me, that's where the abolitionist perspective comes into play. And I think you mentioned, or somebody mentioned recently, talking with Antoinette. I was just recently in a session with Antoinette Scully of the UU Women's Federation, and she did this genius thing where she bottom lined it for me in a way that just really stuck in my brain. So like it's the lowercase a of abolition, not the capital A of abolition. It's where people and communities are doing the work on a smaller scale on local levels. It's the interpersonal work in small groups. And hopefully those nodes of activity are growing into networks of activity, right? And then eventually into movements of activity. And so in the abolitionist viewpoint, we sort of are invited to examine the roots and the underlying causes of the inequity being encountered. That's part and parcel of that ethos. And that fits rather nicely with our liberatory theology. But it's particularly powerful because it's part of a communitarian worldview and outlook. It's where democracy is the most potent and volatile. It's where the theory actually meets the praxis, right? It's on the ground in those synergistic interpersonal interactions that then generate the energy to do the sacred dreaming and to dream beyond where we are to where we need to be. So when we draw that circle of belonging beyond I to we and beyond neighbor to clan or to tribe, and then beyond those configurations of humans and landscape to the self-evident similitude of the large and diverse human family, then we get to the great and good creation, to the sacred all. We are including all those who suffer the harms in that all. That is implied in the theology and the abolitionist perspective. And that connection to all those who are suffering the harms, immediately connects us back to it connects back environmental and climate justice to immigration justice, because you can't ignore immigrants, migrants, refugees, and those who are being forcibly displaced by climate change in your all. If you're being authentic in your theology and your abolitionist liberatory worldview, then your all has to include those who are harmed. And that's why you hear organizers sort of deploy the axiom, organizers and advocates deploy the axiom of like, well, climate justice is immigration justice, and immigration justice is climate justice. And you'll hear that refrain being attached to the other issues precisely for the reason that you described, Nicole, at the top of the interview with the Audre Lorde quote. I mean, that's an eternal quote. That's right up there with the arc of the universe bends towards justice. And we should all take that to heart. I mean, if you're living that way, it's a deeply meaningful way. Now, are you going to be perfect at all times? No, that's not the way the Creator made us. But it helps to try and walk that path. And so for me, I think like many of our challenges in the climate justice space, it's really about striving for, reaching for a better and healthier relationship with both the people and the planet. And at the core of that work is a willingness to apply clear-eyed, sober, and strategic analysis to those root causes and harms, and to sort of become braver as we further evolve our understanding of those things. There was a recent article that sort of listed, I don't know, 40 odd words that you should not use if you're trying to talk to centrist Americans. And when I looked at the list, I was like, gee whiz, 75% of this list are words that you use, love, and use because we like to talk about root harms and causes. And for whatever reason, it seems like a lot of Americans don't always want to talk about root harms and causes. Maybe that goes back to our settler history. Maybe it goes back to being, in certain ways, people who are fleeing oppressions in other parts of the world. But we as Unitarian Universalists find that entire complex of words and ways of describing what we see around us very, very powerful. And I don't think we should walk away from that. I mean, we should understand when to deploy some of that stuff and not. But like fundamentally, that is what our faith is about. It's about being willing to live into those liberatory and abolitionist realities, because we want a universal humanity to be celebrating and enjoying the unity with creation that we think is possible. And so that's why organizers like myself and others will point to this sort of shorthand of climate force displacement and the abuse of others, because they're clear and understandable examples to most human beings. But, as I suggested, it's not just about immigrants and migrants. It's not just in the immigration space, because what's operating here really is the oppression faced by all people along various aspects of their lived identity, whether they're women or they're differently abled or BIPOC communities, queer folks. And, as our friends in the UU animal community would remind us, that includes the non-human residents of our planets. So that all is a very powerful thing. And I think for me, and certainly for UUSJ, it sort of comes back to this core question of how can we properly bring an alternative vision of sustainability, harmony, and balance with Mama Tierra to honor creation, to honor our ancestors, to honor our plant ancestors, to take seriously the teachings of the four directions. If we're excluding some number of our brethren and sistren from our cloak of care and caring, then we are not actually living into our faith tradition. We're not actually living into the best teachings that our faith tradition has to offer. And we're not linking back to those age-old human wisdoms that have been teaching these for ages. So these days, I'm sort of fond of saying that we belong together or we belong to each other as a shorthand reminder that to be in right relationship means to be in right relationship with all. And that is in fact the grand project of justice. That is the journey we're on as human beings. We're asking ourselves, can we move beyond the fictitious silos and humanity's long trials and tribulations with human created evil of othering and hate and oppression? And can we get this right as a species? Can we train our intellect and our spirits as sentient species to get to the great beyond of our own planet? Can we cross that Rubicon of self-destruction hypothesis and what the Fermi paradox describes as we evolve into what I believe the sacred wants us to do, which is to live into our fullest expression of self. And how could we do that work as Project Humanity if we can't understand and accept that most of our ancient wisdoms and wisdom keepers have been teaching us over and over again? We are all one. I am you, you are me, we are all one. So we belong to each other, we belong to the planet, we are the children of Mother Earth and Father Time. We're part and parcel of the sacred, down to the atom, the proton, the neutron, the electron, and even the quarks. And so, similar to the Pando Aspen Grove in Utah, or the fungi linking multiple trees in a forest, some folks call that the wood wide web. Like, we are one, and if we accept that, then it's deeply grounding for our work. If we do not get this, if we do not accept this sacred reality, in fact, I would argue we're working against our own environmental and climate justice goals. In fact, I would say we might be working against our faith tradition's teachings. So that's how I'd answer your first question there, Nicole.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, especially at the end there, that you really described, I think two things. One, right, one of our values, right, which is interdependence, right? It is both a value, but it is also a reality, right? If we do belong to one another, then what we do impacts another person. And that doesn't necessarily mean it impacts the person in your home, in your city, right? What you do, what you buy, right? Who you vote for, what you vote for, um, might impact someone on an island halfway around the world, um, might impact a stranger you don't know one state over. And yet, right? And yet we are still a part of this interconnected web. And so, how are we being responsible stewards, living in our values, understanding that whether you're halfway around the globe, right, or in my congregation, that we have to be in right relationship with all. And I feel like that is, I've said like solidarity, right, being the both moral and strategic um, call of our time, right? That in order to right this ship and right our relationships, right, we actually have to expand that circle of concern to be in solidarity with those that we are not necessarily physically close to, people who don't occupy our same identities, right, but know that our fates are linked, right? The you know, nobody's free, right, until
All of us are
all
free.
of us are
Yeah, and I
free.
mean, and you're you're giving great examples, but not to say the most tragic example, but I mean, just think about it, folks. Like, things are happening to human beings in our environment today that may not express themselves for one or two generations. Like, people get exposed to pollutants, and then their children are the ones who suffer the consequences. Their children are the ones who have the chromosomal shifts and the genetic defects. Their children are the folks who are doing that. Plants and animals get exposed to what we do in our environment, and they don't always die immediately. Sometimes they mutate and they become a different thing. So I feel strongly, as a sentient species, it's our unique responsibility to strive to get this right. And I guess for me, to answer the second part of your question, which was, how do I encourage you to engage on this topic? Maybe it's because of the particular moment we're living through, but my mind goes to the movement building that has to occur now, right? And I want every UU to understand that to engage on this topic, it probably means understanding that the authoritarian movement in the US wants us to be divided and silent as we play spectators to the othering and the scapegoating that's going on, and has become increasingly routine. And I want us to understand that such authoritarian movements require villains and othering precisely to sustain themselves. And I want, with that knowledge in hand, I want folks to get out and act. Now, I don't want them to go out and just do any old thing. I don't want them to go in search of a cathartic opportunity to bash and to smash. But I want UUs to get into the long haul work, not for the loophole, not necessarily for the election that's in front of us, although that's always important. I want UUs to get into the spiritually disciplined advocacy and agitation. And I want them to know that there's a community of national organizers across multiple organizations that joins me in that desire for our community. We want to see that happen. And I ask folks to sort of steep themselves in how to withdraw consent and remembering that silence equals consent, right? And I want you to think about how you mobilize voters, not for candidates, but for issues and on behalf of communities. And I want them to take the passion that many UUs have for climate justice and understand that the true and magnificent scope of taking action for the environment and climate is, in fact, the intersectional work. And I want you to remember that our UUA president, Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, taught us and has suggested that the superpower of environmental and climate justice work, in one way, is the capacity to envision that positive alternative future where we can all thrive and not just survive. And that is a supremely satisfying, creative, liberatory space where BIPOC communities and immigrants have quietly been leading for some time. This is not a new idea. It's not a new capacity, but it's something that those folks, we folks, have been working on for a while in a variety of ways. And I enjoy UUs to really lean into that alternative visioning for what is positive and what is needed, because even in the midst of the mess, we need to be bringing people into a relationship around that alternative, because that's how you counter authoritarian movements. That is how you build the social consensus for that alternative there where we all can thrive and we're not just surviving. That's actually the core of what I want you to do. Now, you can go to any UU website and find something to click on or a session to join, and you can skill up. Side with Love does some awesome skill ups. UUSJ gets some great expert briefers, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't do any of that, sit with the other part. Sit with what it means to be acting in these ways at this particular time, and to really lean into the joy that's needed in expressing the positive alternative vision for what we need and want, because that's what they don't want us to do.
Amen. Um, I think you brought up something that, of course, comes up a lot in in pro-democracy, right, movements, which is this framework that a lot of folks are using around building and blocking, right? How are we blocking the things that are not of our values, that are harming our people, that we don't want, and how are we building the alternatives, building our way towards the vision and the robust and liberatory imagination that we have. And what I've been talking to folks about is that these are not separate things. And I think that is what you brought up. You named it so clearly that when you withdraw your consent, right? Many of our movements now will say, right, non-cooperation, non-compliance. What happens when you turn away from participating in your own oppression or the oppression of others is that in the act of turning away, you are also turning towards something else. You begin actively creating an imagination and building the infrastructure for the new thing, the better thing, the liberatory thing. But it is one action, right? It is a turning away and turning towards. And that is the thing that gives me hope because I see so many of us every single day making that turn, bending that moral arc towards justice. And my final question to you is then, what gives you hope?
Yeah, so I'll keep it simple here. I mean, for me, it's, I try to keep it in the micro. For me, it's my kid being just in proximity to my 9, almost 10-year-old. The optimism of youth and learning adventures. I'm, increasingly working with uh, young adults and emerging adults, trying to get them involved in their work, right? Because youth cohorts are one of the key taproots in this anti-authoritarian movement that we need, right? And we all need to remember it's like youth cohorts and labor cohorts and then faith cohorts. Will we or will we not play the right role? That is the big question, right? So uh keeping my eye on those things. And then optimism also comes from, or hope comes from, like, I talk to a lot of UUs, just like I'm sure you do, Nicole, and I hear them talking about the way they feel responsible for the role that they can play as movement elders, as wisdom keepers, how they feel a mounting responsibility to fight like crazy, to leave a legacy of health, of a healthy planet and of functioning democracy for their descendants. And and you know, when I get down in the doldrums about any given issue, outcome, or whatever, I then have a conversation with somebody who's really experiencing that energy, and it buoys me and it gives me hope. Um, and then I also think about, I caught this wonderful sermon by Reverend John Crestwell out of Annapolis. And he has this beautiful sermon where he talks about expansions and contractions, and you know these things happen over time, and I just pray, and I want to make it possible that after this contraction, there will be a expansion, that after this shriveling of our rights and our democracy, there will be a flowering, and maybe we'll be able to get some of the things that we've wanted for a while that for whatever reason weren't on the table as negotiation points. Because after all, the authoritarian movement has been destroying everything that we, or not everything, but a lot of the things that we have. So we have much more of a whiteboard to do that sacred dreaming and put that new alternative vision on the map, on the board. So that's what gives me hope.
Well, may it be so.
Thank you so. Thank you
Thank
so,
you so
so
much.
much, Nicole.
Deeply appreciate this.
You're welcome.